Today we are going to start our classes on Goblin Market by Christina Georgina Rossetti from CC 10. So today's class is going to be on three things. The first of which is a brief biography of Christina Georgina Rossetti. The second will be a historical context of the poem Goblin Market. So we'll look at the kind of morality the period in which she had written the poem was. We are also going to look at what kind of attitude people had. And specifically, we are going to look at attitudes that are relevant to the poem we are going to read. And finally, we are also going to look at some related literary works. So these are the three topics I'm going to talk about in this introductory lecture on Goblin Market by Christina Georgina Rossetti. So first we'll begin with her biography, of course, and we'll briefly look at what her life was like. So C.G. Rossetti, as she is popularly known, was born into an artistic and well-educated Italian English family, right? So as you may have guessed from her name, if you are aware of what names in different parts of Europe sound like, you probably may have guessed that she is of Italian heritage. So yes, so her brother is also a very popular artist and poet, and you may have heard about him as well. Her brother is Dante Gabriel Rossetti, right? So both of them, both brother and sister, were very prominent poets of Victorian England, and her brother Dante was also a really famous painter, right? More on that later. So Christina's father was a political exile. He was also a poet and translator, and her maternal uncle was a writer and physician to the famous romantic poet Lord Byron, right? So you can see her lineage as having a significant amount of cultural capital being related to poets, translators, and really famous people like Lord Byron, right? So Rossetti, C.G. Rossetti, was educated at home by her mother, Frances, who was devoutly religious, and she influenced her daughter's lifelong devotion to Anglican faith. Right. So Anglican faith is, you may call it a branch or a sub faith within Christianity. Right. So it is different from many other branches of Christianity, but it is basically one sect of Christianity. So despite the family's literary connections, they were relatively poor. And like many young women in her position, Rossetti prepared to become a governess. If you read Victorian literature, you'll come across many women in Victorian novels, in Victorian fiction, who aspired to be a governess, because that was probably the only profession that was available to women at that time, right? It is only much later that women were allowed wider access to education, as a result of which you had women becoming doctors and pursuing all kinds of professions, but that is much later. So in Victorian England, at least, when Victorianism started, when Victoria first became queen, that was not the case, and women had very few professions accessible to them, right? So this is also a bit of Victorian history which you might find relevant. So like I said, C.G. Rossetti prepared to become a governess, right? Which was one of the few respectable occupations for women at the time. But then she was not able to become a governess, and because the job of a governess also involved teaching, right? And this was her poor health, right? So her poor health prevented her from teaching. Naturally, she did not, wasn't able to really pursue her career as a governess. So the Rossetti household was intensely creative and artistic, as you can see from their lineage. I have already mentioned that her father and maternal uncle were writers, poets, translators. Even her mother was educated. So you have a glimpse that education and art runs in the family. So Rossetti, like I said, the Rossetti household was intensely creative and artistic, and all three of her siblings were writers. And her brother, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, helped found the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which is one of the most influential artistic moments of the Victorian period, not just in England but anywhere in the world, right? So it was that significant. Maybe I'll show you a few Victorian or rather Pre-Raphaelite paintings sometime. In fact, when Goblin Market was first published, the edition had sketches and drawings from Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and you will find that edition on the internet. In fact, even if you don't find the edition itself, you're going to find sketches, drawings and paintings that accompanied the original publication, right? So look them up. If you don't find them, let me know. I'll see if I can find them. So all three of her siblings were writers, and like I said, Dante Gabriel was really prominent, and he helped. He was one of the founders of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. It's popularly known as the PRB. So although not an official member, C.G. Rossetti, that is Christina Georgina, collaborated with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, contributing poetry to their journal. So these people, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood people, the brothers there, they had other really significant painters and poets, right? So the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was a group of people who were not just poets or not just painters. They were both. They were as good at poetry as they were at painting, right? So all these people, Swinburne is yet another person associated with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and there are quite a few more, but I'm not going to get into much detail about the PRB in this class. The point that you need to take away from this lecture is that the Pre-Raphaelites were a group who were as interested in poetry or as good and as successful in poetry as they were with their paintings. So Christina Georgina wasn't an official member of the Brotherhood. However, she did contribute poems to the journal that these people published, the Pre-Raphaelite brothers published, and this journal was named the Germ, right? And here in this journal or magazine, as you might want to call it, so in this journal, Christina Georgina wrote under a pen name or a pseudonym, right? And that pseudonym was Ellen Aline, right? And she used to even model for the paintings of the other people of Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood who used to paint. So her early poetry was highly influenced by Romantic literature. As you know, the Romantic period had just come to an end when the Victorian period started. So it was quite recent, and the influence could be seen. The influences of Romantic poetry, Romantic literature can be seen in her early work, right? The other thing that becomes prominent in her early writing is her health, right? Because you find traces that tell us about what her health was like, right? Because and much of her early writing was about disease, about illness, about her perspective of being sick, right? So these early writings had a general theme of love and death, right? So love largely coming from Romantic literature, and death once again coming from Romantic literature, but also being influenced by her own sickness. So as her family's financial situation worsened and her health deteriorated, C.G. Rossetti grew more and more devoutly religious, right? So people find different ways of dealing with difficult situations, right? So in C.G. Rossetti's case, she became more and more religious. So choosing to remain unmarried throughout her life, she led a relatively restricted life devoted entirely to poetry. And yes, not just poetry, but also to religion and the companionship with her mother and aunts, right? So between around 1859 and the late 1860s, she volunteered with the church penitentiary movement, right? And you will see that this becomes an important fact, and we will use this information when we talk about the poem itself, right? So remember that from the late 1850s to the late 1860s. So for about a decade, she was a volunteer for the church penitentiary movement, which offered a home, which also came with religious instruction and training to women who were formerly prostitutes. Right? So you will see the significance when we read the poem, but this is a fact which you might want to note down because it is going to recur when you read the poem. So the experience at this church penitentiary movement, where she, remained for 10 years, it influenced her thoughts about fallen women. Right? We are going to talk about what fallen women means in a while, but let us first have a general idea. So the experience at the church penitentiary movement influenced her thoughts about the fallen woman, and may have influenced Goblin Market, right? So which she published in 1862. So the poem was published during her during her volunteering activities with the church penitentiary movement, when she had come in contact with women who were formerly prostitutes, right? So it was, you may think of the church penitentiary movement as something which was like an NGO at that time, right? So there are similar NGOs working today, and this church penitentiary movement was something of that sort. And here she came to know these women, and that it is believed by many scholars that acquaintance or this familiarity with those women may have influenced her her attitude or her thoughts that led to her writing Goblin Market, right, which was published in 1862, which is in between her which is during her time with the movement. So Rossetti was a prolific writer. She published several collections of poetry, devotional works, and short stories, and contributed to magazines and charity publications. And it may also help to know that during her lifetime, Rossetti had an excellent literary reputation in not just the UK, right, not just in Britain, but in the United States as well, where she was considered as a possible candidate for poet laureate, right, following Tennyson's death, right? So after before Tennyson, Wordsworth was the poet laureate of Britain, of the United Kingdom, following Wordsworth's death, Tennyson became the poet laureate. And then for the first time there was talk of a woman poet laureate, with C.G. Rossetti's name being proposed, right? So she died in 1894, and today she is definitely recognized as one of the finest poets of the 19th century. So that was a brief biography, but do keep in mind that some of the facts that I have mentioned are going to be important while reading and interpreting Goblin Market. So first of which is obviously the church penitentiary movement, and the second is her her devout inclination towards Anglican Christianity, right? So these are two things that are going to come back to us when we read the poem. Now, the second thing that I'm going to talk about, and I guess I'll end today's lecture with this, is the historical context of Goblin Market, right? So when I say historical context, I'm going to look at the backdrop at which the poem was written. So what was society like, which is reflected in Goblin Market? So these are some of the questions we are going to ask and answer. So during the 19th century, there were strict societal expectations about women's behavior. If you read other Victorian works of fiction or even poetry, you are going to see this there as well, right? So there were very strict, rules, which obviously unwritten rules, which women had to conform to because they were expected to do so. And these rules were particularly rigid when it came to expressions of sexuality, right? Once again, you will see this is relevant, extremely relevant to the poem. And there was a distinct sexual double standard, and women suffered much more serious consequences for their sexual actions than did men, right? So what is a double standard? Double standard is when you have different standards for different groups of people, right? So you set a standard which is applicable only to women but not applicable to women. That's a double, something that's applicable to women but not applicable to men. So that's a double standard, right? So you, let's say a country brings a new law, and that law is applicable to certain people. Certain people are, the law is used to punish certain people, but even though other people have committed a crime which is punishable under that law, they are, they are set free. So you see, that's a double standard. So a similar double standard existed in the Victorian period. Obviously, other double standards also existed, but there was a distinct double standard when it came to sexuality, and women were almost always at the receiving end of serious consequences in comparison to men. So in part, this was because many Victorians believed that women were morally superior to men. Once again, you will see this this belief of women being morally superior being relevant to our reading of Goblin Market. But for now, just keep a tab of these facts and these societal beliefs that existed. So partly this was because many Victorians believed that women were morally superior to men. So a sexual transgression marked them out as bad and irredeemable, right? So women were expected to conform to the rules of sexual morality decided by men, right? So if a woman violated these norms, she might be regarded as what is called a fallen woman. Remember, I told you during introducing Christina Georgina's biography that she was very interested in the concept of the fallen woman, right? And during her volunteering days with the church penitentiary movement, she became more interested and familiar with these fallen women, and that has a bearing on the poem. So if a woman during the Victorian era, if a woman violated these sexual norms, she was usually regarded as a fallen woman, and she used to lose her reputation and perhaps even her home, right? And men's sexual behavior was not limited or policed in this way. There was no policing when it came to men's behavior. So as you can see, there was a clear double standard, right? It is not to say that these double standards don't exist, but in Victorian England, they had reached an extreme. So the term fallen itself could encompass a variety of acts, from having an affair to becoming a mistress to prostitution. So the term fallen was applicable to all these cases and more. Let me give you an example of how bad it was for women during Victorian during the Victorian era. So husbands could divorce their wives for being unfaithful, perhaps without proof. And many works of art and literature from the 19th century represented the fallen woman as abandoned by her family, by her husband or lover. And in many Victorian works of art, you will find the woman contemplating suicide or even as a corpse, right? So in Goblin Market, C.G. Rossetti radically revises these typical fates by allowing her fallen woman, Laura. If you have read the poem, you're probably familiar with the names. So in this poem, the fallen woman is Laura, and C.G. Rossetti radically revises all these typical Victorian fate that women suffered by allowing her fallen woman to recover through the help and self-sacrifice of her sister Lizzie. So the man is removed altogether, right? So we are going to talk about this more. We are going to take this forward from the next lecture on. But for today's class, I have brought out several significant facts that you might want to highlight, and many of these aspects, elements, are going to be important in our interpretation and reading of Goblin Market. So I'll end this lecture here. From the next one, we are going to talk about related literary works, and then we'll also look at a few key facts about the poem. All of these we'll do in the next lecture.